Sam Gandy. I work at the Beckley Foundation, which is a charitable trust and think tank devoted to instigating and funding psychedelic research. But my kind of background is ecology. So, yeah, human-nature connection. So I'm going to be having a sort of quick look at psychedelics and their potential role as agents of reconnection, and why that's important in our current situation. So, we are in a sixth mass extinction event due solely to human actions on the biosphere. There was a sort of big report published a few months ago, IPPs Report, and it was the most comprehensive assessment of its kind ever undertaken. Many different hundreds of world experts, hundreds of different, many different countries, looking back over 50 years, took 3 years to do, and it sort of was assessing the state of our ecology, global ecology and biodiversity, and it makes for very grim reading. Species extinctions, global ecological degradation and damage, 1 million species threatened with extinction, and the basic conclusion of the report is without a global mobilization on the scale of World War II to combat the crisis we face, we're doomed. One of the interesting, more positive parts that sort of came to light from this report is that lands under the control or inhabited by indigenous people is not, in some cases, undergoing any ecological degradation at all. And that's an interesting thing to hold in mind, because these people have a very, very strong connection to their land, their nature. They see it as an extension of themselves, so why would you harm that when it's an extension of you? So a lot of these indigenous groups use psychedelics of one kind or another. Not all of them do, and that's important to sort of say. But in different parts of the world, we have Huchals using peyote, cactus, Yanomami using DMT, Yopo snuffs, Mazatec using mushrooms, Kashinara and other Amazonian Indian groups using ayahuasca, and more besides. So, disconnection. We can consider that people, these indigenous groups, who have this very intimate connection to their habitat, and so they have a very sort of solid ecological perspective relating to it, they're at sort of, I guess, one end of the spectrum, and Western civilization is sort of at the other end of the spectrum. But so this disconnection from nature, which I'll go into a bit more detail with, is the root cause of the environmental crisis we face. That is the symptom of that disconnection. But beyond that, we also are suffering from disconnection on a sort of more zoomed-in scale, so disconnection from ourselves and others. It was interesting, some psilocybin depression research conducted by Imperial College found that, my friend Rosa Watts found that as part of her qualitative assessments that 17 of 20 people who responded to the psilocybin therapy, so these are people with major depression who tried different therapies and treatments and nothing had worked, 17 out of 20 all responded to varying degrees, and all of them independently said that they felt disconnected and that the psilocybin had reconnected them to themselves, to others, to the world at large. So this disconnection on a very broad sense to nature is fueling the environmental crisis, and the disconnection on a sort of more interpersonal level is fueling the mental health crisis. So a few useful concepts, just to sort of bear in mind. The concept of biophilia, hypothesis presented by biologist E.O. Wilson. It refers to our innate fondness for and connection to nature. We evolved, we've spent 99.9% of our species' existence in natural environments, so our physiology, our psychology is adapted for that. But key thing here is that theme of connection, so the connections that human beings subconsciously seek with the rest of life. And another sort of interesting concept to keep in mind as well is the overview effect reported by astronauts viewing the Earth from space. And some of them, many of them, undergo a profound cognitive shift. And yeah, this kind of thing can be described as truly transformative experiences involving senses of wonder and awe, unity with nature, transcendence, and universal brotherhood. And this is sort of very, very sort of aligned to what people report under psychedelic mystical type experiences. It would be a very transformative event if we could send everyone to space so they could have this effect. I think it would be a very different world, but obviously that's not feasible, and I feel that psychedelics are an alternative and perhaps more accessible route to a similar transformative perspective. So, nature connection or nature relatedness as a measure is something very important. So for you as an individual, the more closely you relate to being part of nature, the better psychological shape you're going to be in. Your anxiety is likely to be lower, your happiness ratings, your life satisfaction, your vitality, your psychological functioning at the trait and state level will be higher. It's one of the big predictors of psychological physical health. So that's one thing. But perhaps more interestingly and importantly, your level of connection to nature is perhaps the strongest single psychological predictor of pro-environmental, pro-ecological behavior that outperforms all other variables. So as your connection to nature increases, by extension, your concern for it goes up as well. And it's interesting, there's been some research on environmental education and connection, and nature connection is very much stronger at predicting one's pro-environmental behavior than simply knowing about nature. There needs to be that emotional, empathic connection to it, and this is where the psychedelics seem to sort of play their part well. So yeah, as mentioned, psychedelics are agents of biophilia, biophilia-enhancing agents or agents of reconnection that have been used for a long, long time and are now experiencing a resurgence research here in the Western world. So it's sort of just worth mentioning the mechanisms by how we think these shifts in nature connection occur. So under a large dose of psychedelics, such as psilocybin, your default mode network in your brain, which is sort of a fundamental component of your sense of self, begins to sort of relax and dissolve. And when that happens, perceived boundaries between self and other, so how you sort of feeling separate from the world and the universe, that which is a cunning trick of the brain, it's worth saying that is an illusion, a very cunning one concocted by your brain, that all dissolves and breaks down. So you have this kind of expanded overlap, this unity with nature, with the universe, and the perspective shift, the memory of that shift is very powerful and tangible, and it stays with people long after the experience. So this is just a survey conducted by David Luke. I don't know if he's here yet, but this was an interesting sort of one of the earliest studies sort of looking at the effect of psychedelics on nature connection. It was interesting, of 150 people who completed the survey, all said they felt more nature connected. Psilocybin mushrooms are definitely top of the pile there, but also LSD and ayahuasca. And you see, interestingly, ketamine, which is a dissociative, is very much the other way and makes people detached and sort of non-caring. So, psilocybin, the bulk of the psychedelic research that's been conducted so far has been on psilocybin. And so, two of the interesting things that psilocybin does in the long term. So a year following dosing, your measures of openness and nature-relatedness may well remain high. And that's interesting in the sense that, firstly, people are having these experiences in clinical environments, very much nature-deprived, and yet their connection to nature subsequent to that experience is still dramatically increased in some cases, and it's an enduring increase as well. And so that's important and interesting. And then openness as well. The personality trait openness is one of the 5 big measures of personality, and it's associated with creativity and openness to new experiences, hunger for knowledge, appreciation for aesthetics, but it's also the strongest psychological predictor of a connection to nature and pro-environmental behaviour. And so, yeah, this is some research I've been involved with colleagues at Imperial College, some online survey data, and we found sort of this very, very strong, unusually strong statistical effect of nature-relatedness, of lifetime usage of classical psychedelics predicting nature connection relatedness. And this was sort of a really kind of powerful effect, particularly with people who rated below average for nature-relatedness prior to their psychedelic experience. And also we found this was very much correlated with well-being, as we kind of expected from the literature. And this was a really interesting, important paper published a few years ago by a guy from Yale and a colleague, and they found that this increase in pro-environmental behavior that psychedelic users report, firstly, it's unique to classical psychedelics. You don't get this with other drugs. It's specifically to do with them. But the increased pro-environmental behavior was tied to their nature-relatedness, to the degree to which they identified with nature. The environmental movement was sort of pretty much, I don't know if it was born in the 1960s, but it very radically expanded and bloomed. And this was a time, obviously, of widespread usage of psychedelics, but also the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement. There was lots of sort of anti-governmental, countercultural movements in full swing. Richard Nixon felt very strongly that LSD made hippies. And so if you banned that, you would stop sort of these people kind of, making his life tough. And going on some of the research that's already been conducted, it seems like he may well have been onto something, because people post-psychedelic are more connected to nature. And there's interesting research from Imperial. People become anti-authoritarian. They don't like being told what to do. There's a powerful sense of authority that comes through a primary mystical experience, and it kind of supersedes external sources of power and governance, and that's threatening to those structures. So the banning of LSD and other psychedelics in the 60s, or at the end of the 60s, was a political move, window dressed as a public health measure. So it's interesting to note that Albert Hofmann, inventor, discoverer of LSD, discoverer of psilocybin, when he was looking back at his life, so he was 101, he died 102, and mentally totally sharp to the day he died. And looking back at his life, he came to feel that our disconnection from nature and the ability of psychedelics to remedy that was perhaps their single most important property. And he said, alienation from nature and the loss of the experience of being part of a living creation is the greatest tragedy of our materialistic era. It is the causative reason for ecological devastation and climate change. Therefore, I attribute absolute highest importance to consciousness change. I regard psychedelics as catalyzers for this. So, psychedelics alone, we don't need to connect with nature. The simple act of being out in nature increases one's nature connection. I think psychedelics are potentially useful. Not everyone's been fortunate enough to grow up and live around nature, and they might grow up without that connection. And what I think psychedelics can do is the power they have is to convert nature skeptics and reconnect people who've maybe not been that fortunate in that regard. But we, as a species, as a civilization, we urgently need to reconnect on broad levels, but we need to reconnect to nature if we're going to save ourselves and a lot of the life that shares the planet with us. Thank you.